work now. So hi, my name is Diana. I'm working as a privacy specialist, and I'm basically working only on data protection law. And today we're going to take a nice dip into the idea of the European Union General Data Protection Regulation. Why this is important for you is that either if you're part of research in the future or working in practice on machine learning or AI, you will come through the GDPR many, many times. And there's a lot of concerns when it comes to machine learning or even artificial intelligence due to the fact that privacy is the one right that we actually want to adhere to when thinking about privacy of people. These are things that are actually impacting all of our lives. And still, we need to protect these rights. And for this, we have the GDPR. So as you're probably not that familiar with the GDPR yet, could any one of you imagine what you have seen from the GDPR so far? Any ideas? Okay, let me give you an example. This is something that is due to the GDPR. We have the use of cookies, which is we are collecting several kinds of data through stored files on web browsers. And they contain not only the things that we need to make websites run, but they also contain things like marketing. So we're basically tracking people through different websites, and we're getting to know them. We're getting to know their preferences, their interests. And the GDPR tells us, together with the e-privacy regulation, which is basically another legal instrument within the EU, they tell us we can do this, but we need to inform the data subject, which is the person whose information we're collecting. The other thing you see is the privacy policy. Whenever you enter a website, you don't only have to click that you consent to having cookies, but you also have to click yes to accepting the privacy policy in which all of your rights are stated. So let's go through what we're going to do today. I think our aim is quite humble, but still pretty much, let's see how we're going to deal with it. So firstly, I would like to tell you a little bit about the GDPR, just a kind little overview about what is personal data, what are the processing principles. Then we're just going to go through one real life example, talking about if we take a snapshot in public or in a private place, what are we allowed to do with it? Then also the automated decision-making under the GDPR. So technically the GDPR is technology neutral, meaning that it applies to all technologies that we have at the moment within the EU, but there's two special parts that are only dedicated to automated machine decision-making, sorry. The last part is going to be the ethical part. What are the ethical problems arising from the use of machine learning and AI, and why is this important to all of us? Okay, first part, personal data. Yes. Am I too far away? Okay, is it? I think now I hear, oh, now I hear myself. Okay, I'm sorry, the cable here is not very long, so I'm sitting like this. Okay, I will try. Okay, so the first question is, what is personal data? Personal data basically is any kind of information that relates to a person so that we can identify it or so that it becomes identifiable. That can mean anything. It means the name, home address, email address, but it is also the cookie ID. It is also the advertisement ID, and it is also the IP address. There's also other ways in which we have personal data. It is not only the direct data, but in the future, you will see that also inferences and the combination of data can create new personal data. So if we take this picture, our snapshot that I probably took illegally, which of these pictures, according to what you see, would you think contains personal data? The man in the back? The left one, this one. Think about the persons on the picture. Can you identify them? Exactly. So we're not looking at the place at this point, we're looking at the persons. And in the first picture on the very left, you see that there are people, but unless you're very close friends and you have seen them before in the evening already, and they're close, you're probably not going to be able to identify them, right? Okay, yeah. So if we go to the next example, would I not have put some black marks on the faces? Would you be able to identify these people? Would that be personal data? I see some nodding here. Yes, exactly. So here we would basically be able to identify the person because we would see their face directly. What about the next picture? Okay, I see again, no. Yeah, that's true. What about this picture? And again, no. Exactly. If we would have to any of these pictures, a prior picture, for example, in this case, whatever is here, the person that is here, if we would have a picture of that person in any other context from the front, and we could, according to the jacket, identify the person, or to the posture, to the height, then this would probably be personal data. But in the case that we have it now, we cannot identify the person, so it's not personal data. Okay, so in our snapshot, we can actually have personal data in snapshots. Whenever we have personal data on snapshots, so whenever we can identify a person, we have to think, do we actually fall under the GDPR or do we not? The GDPR is meant for commercial purposes. That means that we have a household exemption. The household exemption means that we are not falling under the GDPR because we're not actually working in the commercial realm. This will be the case if you take a private picture of your friends at home, or if you take a picture of your friends in public without having anybody around. This does not fall under the GDPR, so there you don't have a problem. But then the question is, what happens if you actually take this picture and you want to upload it on social media? I'm sorry, was there something? Okay, I will just ignore this. So let's assume you have the picture done. You know it contains personal data, but it's probably your friends.
Okay, visto.
In this case, can you upload to social media? What do you think? Yes, you can. Actually, the case is not that easy. So there was a case in the Netherlands. Maybe this changes your mind. There was a case in the Netherlands where a grandma actually posted a picture of her grandchildren after playing with them and posted them. She posted them on Facebook. She was happy. She just wanted to show her grandchildren, and she got into a fight with the mother of the children. So the whole case went in front of the court, and the court actually found that it belongs to the GDPR and that the grandma has to ask the mother for the consent because she is the legal representative. So does that change your mind? Yes? Okay. This is actually a very interesting part. So what you're going to see in the future in your work life and also in your studies is that we have a lot of norms that are going to influence your life, but not all of them are always in one line. Not everything is always straight. So whenever you are trying to actually identify whether you fall under the GDPR or not, the Article 29 Working Party, which is basically a governing party of the EU, they are trying to give guidelines. They have opinions and guidelines. They are now replaced by the EDPB, but we also always have these parties to the legislation that are trying to give us some guidance, some opinions. So this was the Article 29 Working Party until a few years ago. Now it's the EDPB. They gave us a test for what falls under the household exemption and what does not. The first question is, to how many people are you actually disseminating the information? So you can imagine if you're on Facebook, you will probably be exposed to many more people than if you're showing it around in a group where there's 5. Is the personal data about individuals who have a personal relationship to you or not? Does the scale and frequency of the processing suggest professional or full-time activity? So if you're posting a lot, then there's a chance that you might fall under this because you might do this professionally. Is there evidence of a number of individuals acting together in a collective manner, which would mean that maybe you're organized, maybe you have some commercial purpose behind it, so maybe that falls under it. Or also, is there a potential adverse impact on individuals, including intrusion into their privacy? And here it actually becomes interesting. What is intruding into our privacy, considering the fact that we're putting everything we have online? Well, we can imagine a case in which you have a coworker and you're making a picture of him while he's sitting on his laptop working. And the next day, you're taking a picture of him where he's sitting in front of his laptop drinking a beer. In this case, probably this could be an intrusion into his privacy that he didn't want. So this is how we can actually identify. But in general, it's just important for you to know that technically, whenever you're acting in private, you should not fall. But there's still a chance that maybe a court finds different. Then we have the Lindqvist case, one of the most famous data privacy cases, because it's also quite old. It's from the 90s. There was an old lady. She was part of a religious group, and she put up this website for all parishioners. And she had names, hobbies, job titles of the people that belonged to that group. And she also sent some prayers and nice greetings to one of the members that had actually fallen ill. I think she broke her leg. So the question was actually put in front of the court, and the question was, is that a household activity? In fact, it was found that even though she was doing this in the course of a religious and charitable organization, this does not fall under the household exemption. So also that was seen to be a commercial purpose, and therefore she fell under the GDPR and she violated it. Technically, I have to say, the GDPR came into force in 2018. So it was the predecessor of the GDPR, Directive 95/46. But the case is still applicable nowadays. Okay, then we have to take into account when we're talking about privacy and data protection that we do not only have the GDPR. There's many other instruments that we have and that we have to take into account. The most important ones being the fundamental and the human rights. We have a fundamental right to data protection, we have a fundamental right to privacy, and we have a human right to privacy. Also, different states nominate different rights that are applicable. So if we, for example, take our snapshots to Germany, Germany has a constitutional right to one's own picture. So in this case, there's a good chance that not only the GDPR is going to be applicable, but also other norms. Okay, so we assume now that our snapshots do not fall under the household exemption. In this case, we always have to ask for consent. I believe that we all know what consent means, but technically, if we want to define it legally, it's a free will that we are using. We are informed and we have the choice, we make the choice and we make an act that shows our choice. So in the case of cookies, we probably tick a box. So if the GDPR applies, there's many other things we have to take into account. One of the most interesting ones probably being the principles. So in the case of machine learning, let's think what is the most important things. We want to have a lot of data, right? We want to ensure that our models are good, so we want to have a lot of data. Funnily, the GDPR sees that different. We have the data minimization principle, which means we are not allowed to take any more data than the one that is absolutely necessary. We also have the storage limitation, meaning that we are not allowed to store data forever, but we have to define what is the purpose and for how long do we need the data until we can delete it because the purpose is fulfilled. Then we have the lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Lawfulness basically just meaning that we have a legal basis for what we're doing. Fairness, quite obvious. Transparency means that we have to inform the data subject, so the person whose information we are taking. Purpose limitation, as I already said, means that we have to have a specified purpose. So if I would come today and say, I want all of your names and email addresses because I might use them in the future, this is not a specified purpose. If I say, I would like to have your name and email addresses because I want to send you the slides afterwards, this would be a specified purpose. This is something that is going to be acceptable. And this is what we're going to have to do for every single data that we are taking. We need to define a purpose and also how long we are going to store it. And we need to inform the person about it. The next one is accuracy. Accuracy means that the persons actually have the right for their data to be accurate. How we can ensure this? Well, there's an active right of a data subject to, when they find out that the data that we have about it, the information that we have about the person is not up to date anymore, or it is not right, they can come and ask us to actually rectify the data. This is what accuracy here means. We need to ensure the data is accurate and it's up to date. Integrity and confidentiality. Integrity and confidentiality basically belong into the realm of the data security. So it means that we need to ensure that the personal data we are gathering and using, meaning processing, is actually secured from others using it, for others interfering with it, from us accidentally losing it, or from unauthorized access. Then we have accountability, which basically just means that we are responsible for it. We need to be held, we can be held, and we will be held accountable for what we're doing. Was I too fast? Was that all clear to you? Yeah? Perfect. Happy to hear that. Okay. So if you use the snapshot and many other snapshots for machine learning, what is going to happen? Well, if you're using it in the course of your research, there's a chance that you fall under the scientific exemption, which is one of the cases that are actually ruled by state. But in general, it does not mean that, as same as the household exemption, you would fall out of the realm of the GDPR. It barely means that you do not have to adhere to all of the requirements from the GDPR. So if you're working in research and you want to use machine learning, what you can basically get rid of when you want to use data is that the data subject does not have the right to have their data rectified. It does not have the right to ask for access to their personal information, or to ask for restriction, or to completely object. Also, this, taken with a grain of salt, is not always the case, but this is what we can end up with if we are lucky. Best technique here would be to basically anonymize the data so that you are not falling under this. So if we're having a commercial purpose, then finally we get to the legal basis. You want to collect personal data, so you need to have a legal basis. That can be consent, as we have already talked about. That can be the performance of a contract, the compliance with a legal obligation. But oftentimes it's also going to be the legitimate interest. Legitimate interest is quite interesting, funny, because it is a balancing test. We are basically balancing our interest in having the personal data against the interest of the data subject not having the personal data disclosed. So here, what is going to be the case is that you have to weigh the interest of the data subject, and maybe their human rights, their fundamental rights, because we have them, against your commercial interest. Okay, finally, yes. Yeah, that is actually a wonderful thing. So the cookies are mostly governed by the GDPR and the e-privacy policy. Nowadays, we actually have the fortune that there's a lot of legal cases around cookies. So it was just recently found that Google Analytics, for example, is not legal. It is not doing the right thing because it is transferring data outside of the European Union, so it doesn't have the same value, the protection that is given in the US. Technically, this should not happen. Technically, the legitimate interest should not be valid. But right now, the problem is, how can we enforce this? So the GDPR is basically the authorities are going into trying to enforce as much as possible. And right now cookies are under scrutiny, so you can expect a lot of changes. But if you imagine what could be the legitimate interest of you and then of the company, there's probably not so much that the company can bring forward. Yeah, this is actually a problem that you will always have in law, that it is one thing that is written down, but it is the other thing what is enforced and what is adhered to. Did I answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, so automated decision making. We have two articles that are applicable only to automated decision making and machine learning. And that is Article 21 that tells us the data subject has a right to object on grounds relating to his or her particular situation at any time to processing of personal data concerning him or her. This is the first part. So the person whose information we want to have has a right to say, no, I just don't want. Then the second part, based on necessity for tasks carried out in public interest or based on legitimate interest, we still might have, in these cases, we can say no. So basically, we first have the right to say no, and then we have the part that tells us only say no in cases where it's based on legitimate interest or for necessity for a task carried out in public interest. Then we have the next paragraph saying the controller shall then no longer process personal data unless it demonstrates legitimate interests outweighing the interest of the data subject. So basically what that means is if the data subject does not want to have their personal data used, then the controller, so the person that is wanting to process the personal data, is not allowed to unless they can bring grounds forward why they should still be able to. Okay, and when it comes to direct marketing, we can always say no for obvious reasons, I guess. Sorry. Okay, then we have the most interesting article in the GDPR, which is the right not to be subjected to decisions based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal or similar effects. So the question is, what are legal or similar effects? Could any one of you imagine a case in which we are using decisions reached by automated decision-making only that have a legal effect on us or a similarly grave effect? Okay, so you already see some on the slide. If we're talking about a legal aspect, imagine you are asking for asylum in another country, and the decision is based not on a person making the decision, but on automated decision making. In this case, if the decision tends to be no, then the question is that a legal fact? And did it actually, did I have a right not to be subject? And yes, this would be the case. In this case, we would have a legal effect of a decision that is based solely on automated processing. Yes. Credit risk scoring? Scoring. I'm not quite sure. Mortgage, yeah. So it's probably not going to be a legal effect, but it's going to be a similar effect because it does not have direct legal consequences for you, but it does influence your life. It influences your economic situation gravely. So also this is going to fall under this article. Okay, so Article 22 has a fantastic structure. The first paragraph tells us that there is a right not to be subjected to decisions based solely on automated decision making. And then it gives us the exceptions right away. So this does not apply in cases where it is necessary for entering or performing a contract, or where member state law requires differently, or where explicit consent was given. And here comes a very funny thing under the GDPR. We have consent, we've already talked about this, but then explicit consent should be something that we use mostly in cases that we consider more sensible. So we have the automated decision making, and we have special categories of data. That would be health, anything relating to trade union membership, sexual orientation, political ideas, religious beliefs. All of these are basically a part of personal data that we consider to be very sensitive. So we want to give this kind of data special protection. We want to ensure that this kind of data about us is only used when absolutely necessary. And there comes explicit consent. And now the fun fact is that explicit consent has no definition. We know that we want to have a specific protection. We say it has to be an explicit consent, but what exactly that means is not very clear. And a scenario which we can imagine is that when we're usually using cookies, we tick boxes. Explicit consent could be something where we actually have to put our signature. We have to sign a document. But this is actually never used. I have never seen it. I'm not sure if anybody uses it, but I don't think that there is much of this happening. So this is like a fun part that we have here, because we are still trying to figure out how exactly can we achieve explicit consent. So then after the exceptions comes, when the exceptions are applicable, we have a right to human intervention on the side of the controller to give their opinion. Let's assume we're in a machine learning process. We have a model. What could be the problem with having the third point? Can any of you imagine? Okay, so let's assume we are in a very difficult scenario, and we are basically trying to get one of the points that I have mentioned before, maybe a mortgage, maybe a loan. We are taking a lot of data to actually make a founded decision. How can we ensure that the person has the exact possibility to check how the decision was reached? So they would have to go through all of the data that we have collected. But at some point, we can imagine a model in which it is not possible anymore to make the review based on the same data that was given to the model. It's quite easy to actually exceed the realm of what a human being is able to comprehend, and also on the time that a person has that is working somewhere. If somebody sits 4 months on trying to evaluate how the decision was reached and if it was justified or not, then giving their opinion is going to be quite difficult. So it was not really thought about, or maybe it was not taken into account, that there is a chance that the volume of data that we're using for certain decisions might exceed what is actually feasible for the person that is supposed to intervene and to give their opinion. So, as I've talked about beforehand, special categories of data may not be processed, which is funny because if we're considering personalized advertisement or personalized news provision, we can imagine a very easy case in which we find out what exactly the person thinks in the political realm or their sexual orientation within a few minutes. Let's just imagine we have the personalization of news, and a person is clicking constantly on very left-wing articles. How hard is it going to be for us to define, okay, this person is probably left-wing? Not going to be very hard, but still we have that in the GDPR. Okay, so we basically have the right of human intervention. We saw the exceptions, and now comes another fun fact. We have the right to meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significance and the envisaged consequences of the processing for the data subject. Which means that for you, whenever you're applying machine learning, you actually have to figure out a way on how to explain to the person when you have reached an automated decision. So whenever you're dealing with personal data, there is a chance that a person might come to you and ask for how was the decision reached, and you will need to be able to basically give an explanation about this. This is something that is obviously quite easy with some models, but very difficult when it comes to more complex systems. So just be aware, I linked one of my favorite articles about this, because actually even the right in itself is not clear right now because it lacks feasibility in many consequences. And then the right to human intervention, we have already talked about this. Also there, I just linked in case you're interested, you can have a look. Okay, would anybody have the time? Let me check. Okay, we still have some time. Okay, then we have the information right of the data subject. So basically, whenever we are using machine learning or any kind of processing of data, so when we're collecting personal data, the person has a right to be informed. And now if you think back, when have you been informed about all the things that are listed on the slide? Okay, a little. How did you get that information? Exactly. Exactly. The hyperlink leads to the privacy policy. There's actually a study, there's quite many studies about that, but there is a study that evaluated how many hours of our lifetime we would have to spend on privacy policies if we wanted to read them, because usually nobody reads them, if we're honest. And it was something around 260 hours per year. I think we all have something better to do with that. But technically, we have the right to be informed. But here comes the very important question that you have to raise under the GDPR. Does it make sense? We are going under the assumption that a data subject is a person that is informed and that based on the information that they get can make a smart decision about their privacy. But if we see how many hours we would have to invest only on the privacy policy, and then it is still questionable if we would understand it. This is actually a huge problem because it is not going to be that case. Exactly. It is not going to happen. We're not going to understand all of it and then make a smart decision, especially if the next time we look at the exact same website, we are asked this again if we said no. So this is something that you have to take with a grain of salt. There's a lot of things that still need to be defined and changed. But I think this is something that we can all take away from this. Even if we wanted to make smart decisions, in this case, it's very unlikely that we would be able to, and that we would actually have the time and energy to do this. Okay, so now are the active rights. I think they are way more interesting for all of us because we do have a lot of rights when it comes to what we are allowed to request from people having our personal data. Once this is the right to access, we have a right to go to the person that is the commercial entity that is actually having our data and ask for access. So they have to give us all the information they have about us so that we know which kind of information they gathered. We also have the right to withdraw consent, which is obviously not that easy as it should be. But whenever you have consented to anything, you have the right to withdraw this consent, and then the legal basis is missing and the commercial entity is not allowed to use your personal data anymore. We have the right to object to processing. We have the right to data portability, which basically means that we should get a package from commercial entity A and go to commercial entity B without any problems. We also have the right to rectification and erasure. That means that we can have our data rectified in case it is wrong or it is outdated. And in cases where we believe that the personal information that was gathered about us is not displaying us as people anymore, it is not valid anymore, we actually have the right to have the data erased. There was a case that is called the Google Spain case, in which a person was basically going bankrupt. And his house was sold based on the fact that he was bankrupt. The newspaper article that was displaying that was put up to Google. Google could find it through search engine. So it was there for eternity. And he found, hey, I actually don't think that this is displaying me anymore. I'm not bankrupt anymore, and I do not want to be seen as this person. He went in front of the court, and it was found that there was a right to have this data erased. So what happened was that the Google search engine was not allowed to find that newspaper anymore because the newspaper fell under a journalistic exception, but the mere link that was made between the newspaper and Google so that everybody Googling his name would find this was deleted because it was the idea that it is not displaying the person anymore. It is not evaluating the person anymore, and therefore he should have the right to not be triggered by his past all the time. Okay, then we have the right to lodge a complaint. So whenever you think that a controller or a commercial entity is doing something wrong, you have the right to go to the supervisor authority, which in our case would be the Finnish ombudsman, and ask them to actually check what is happening. Also, whenever you're using automated decision making, you have to inform the person that you are applying automated decision making, which is quite reasonable considering that if we want to go against automated decision making, we first need to know that it is there. Then also, when we're talking about automated decision making, we have to inform that the data subject actually has the right to ask us for an explanation. And where processing is based on explicit consent, we have the right to obtain human intervention. Also that we have to tell the data subject. And we can use, in our case, if we want to check out what happens. So if we go back to our initial idea of taking snapshots and using it for machine learning, what I think is the biggest takeaway for you, if you do that, always ask the persons that are on the picture for consent so that you're on the safe side. Determine the purposes for which you're actually using the data and let the persons know. Go through the list that you have and think and give all the information that is necessary, and make sure that the personal data is safe. This is something that is oftentimes undervalued, but we need to ensure that nobody else can get this data. We are not accidentally losing it. And therefore, we need to ensure that we have applied additional safeguards to make sure nothing is going to happen to the personal data except what we are doing to it. Oh, and never forget to try to make your machine learning model explainable. Okay, do you have any questions so far? Yeah. I don't think you can automate this process, because basically what consent tells us is it has to be a free choice, and the person itself has to indicate that this is their free will. So basically, maybe just make sure that there's not so many people around that whose face you can see. Actually, there's something very funny about this. We have a company that is called Clearview AI. Maybe some of you have already heard or read in the newspaper. Okay, so Clearview AI is a company that was used by government authorities for facial recognition. So basically the idea was, we have CCTV, we want to find criminals, why not combine this, have some facial recognition, get some criminals, everything's going to be fine. Now, however, Clearview AI had not only lawsuits because of their facial recognition in the first place, but now they announced, when having a stakeholder meeting, that with 100 billion additional dollars, I believe it was in dollars, they would be able to identify every single person on Earth. So it doesn't matter if you have the person from the front, you see their face, but they said they would be able to basically decide who it is out of all persons on Earth based on the way they walk. So there's many points that you can actually take away from this. And I will not discuss the question if this is feasible or not, because I truly don't know the answer. But let's just imagine what this would mean for a person. So that will mean you cannot ever take a picture again without the person on the picture being identifiable. And the idea is actually to exploit this commercially. It's not only to use this for state authorities, and already this is questionable. But the idea is to actually exploit this commercially. So let's just keep that in mind, and think that there are so many pictures of different people on social media that the chance of not being identified is actually getting smaller. But yeah, to your answer, technically you will always fall under the household exemption. You can just not be that sure to not try to take a little eye on it. Okay. So, we're already with the societal impact. I don't even know how I got here. So there's a lot of things that we have to talk about when we're thinking about ethical concepts, when we think about the moral grounds for doing certain things. Now, I have already talked about Clearview AI. This is probably the best example of how we do not want the world to look like. None of us wants to be identified wherever we are just by our backs. And we also do not want this general assumption. If we think the basis of the facial recognition that we're talking about here is basically that every of us would be seen as criminals until it's proven differently. All of us would be stored somewhere with the assumption that maybe at some point we're actually becoming criminals, and then it was justified to use all of the information they had about us. Other things are basically the question, what kind of societal impacts can machine learning have, can AI have? Where does it lead to? And there's a lot of fear in the world and also in the EU about what is going to happen. One of the things being that in this moment, we have the frightful five, which is 5 companies ruling and basically influencing the most technical research, then also the public discourse and societal impacts. Who do you think is that? Sorry? Microsoft. Yes, those are our frightful five. And it is very interesting. There's a lot of papers about this. And we have to consider, if you have so much power, which is also more money than several states, then you have a lot of unbalanced ideas. You have a lot of unbalanced right and power that does not meet somebody else. It does not meet many legislators. It does not meet many regulators. So there's a real fear that these companies are able to influence the future of AI and machine learning in a way that is not going to benefit society. And we already see it now. If we consider who is the most benefiting from AI and machine learning applications, this is not going to be anywhere, but it's going to be with these five companies. So this is one of the impacts that we're actually trying to maybe get rid of in the future, so that we can ensure that everybody, all and the whole world at the same time, is possible to or is able to actually benefit from these technologies. Another question is, how can we ensure that with the machine learning models we have and with the AI we're developing, we are not basically reinforcing old historical biases? And there's a lot of fear that in the future we will take the biases that have been there in societies beforehand, the historical biases against certain demographics, against the gender, against the political idea, and we're putting this unwillingly and maybe even not knowingly into the world by reinforcing it with AI and machine learning. So we always have to make sure that we're actually not taking anything that reinforces the old biases, so that we're not excluding disproportionately other groups that we have not thought about in the first place. Also, the question of access rights. This has basically something to do with distribution fairness. So what exactly are the rights that we're getting here? What is the rights that we have access to? What can we access with the automated decisions? If we assume that there's already cases, there was a case from Amazon, for example, in which the zip code where a person was living was determining whether these people were getting special advertisements, whether they were getting special offers. And they were not getting them because they were living in a quarter that was considered quite poor. So this has a direct influence, not only on the historical bias, but also on how we're ensuring that poor people are never going to get good deals, that poor people are not having the same access right to certain things as others. And in this case, it might only be products, but we can think of other cases in which we're talking about education, we're talking about job opportunities. And we want to make sure that we always acknowledge that there must be a moral basis to the things that we actually try to achieve. And we should have that in mind. Okay, so one of the influences based on which we are basically thinking this is necessary is, as I said, a lot of fear that comes from the EU itself at the moment. Because of that, we have a drafted AI regulation. It is not enforced yet, and it is not sure whether what we see here now is basically what is going to be enforced. But I wanted to show you to also display the fact that there is something coming. There's not only the GDPR right now, which is kind of vague and we can get along many things, but we're actually trying to find a way to implement morals and to ensure that the most grave impacts are circumvented. So may I introduce you to the draft AI regulation that is in the EU right now? The regulation divides into three different categories. We have the prohibited use of AI and models, we have high risk, and we have low risk. I just brought you the prohibited practices today because I think it is important for us to see that there's a lot of development right now, which is also going to make your life harder, whether you're in research or in a commercial world. You will have to take into account all of these things. So if we look into the first requirement, we have the placing on the market or use of AI systems using subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness to materially distort a person's behavior. What do you understand from that? Let's assume we have personalized advertisement. The goal of personalized advertisement is going to be that the person whose information we are using to make them buy something, we are basically trying to trick them. We're trying to manipulate them into buying things they might not need. We're not only trying to make the product especially attractive, but much of personalized advertisement, when using a lot of information about a person, can already go into the realm of manipulating. So the question is the EU really going to prohibit that? I'm not sure about this, but it is important to take into account. The more information we are using about a person, the closer we would be to manipulating into somebody into doing something that is not good for them, which would be to randomly buy things they don't need. The next question is AI systems exploiting vulnerabilities of a specific group of persons due to age, physical or mental disability to distort behavior of a person, which is likely to cause harm to that person. So what can we imagine here? We can think about underage people, children. We can think about people that might have some kind of mental disability. But if we think about somebody having depressions, and we know that people that have depressions are more likely to make short thought reactions, to have short thought reactions, meaning that somebody who is depressed might be buying things out of an affect more easily. Now, so this we would not be allowed to use, but the question is how to circumvent if we detected that with our advertisement in the first place. And the question is that grave enough to basically fall under this regulation in the future? The last point, I think, is the one that might make us all happy. It says, use of AI by public authorities to classify trustworthiness of persons or characteristics with the social score leading to either detrimental or unfavorable treatment. So we're trying to not get into the 1984 that we're all expecting, and we're trying to not get into social scoring, in which all of our movements are tracked, and in which, based on the tracking, we are found to be either suitable as persons or not. And this shows basically the most interesting and most important part that I want you to take away, if you take anything away from today, that we are constantly in the realm of thinking about the privacy of a person, what is in us, in our private life, what we do not want to share with the world, and security, which is basically the state trying to secure us from terrorism, trying to secure us from criminals. And this is oftentimes going to be used. This is oftentimes used, the idea that we have to give up our freedom to get security. And this is a constant clash that we will have to fight in the future, and we will have to decide either we want to have privacy as our freedom or we want to have security. It's not an either or decision, but what the EU is trying here is trying to find what is the absolute limit of security, what is the absolute limit of what we are allowing our governments to do to secure, that we allow on the privacy of our citizens. And I think at least making sure that we are not going to be constantly monitored and therefore scored as people, valued as people. We basically would be given a value with a social scoring system. It would say, hey, they are not behaving right, so we are not considering them for having beneficial treatment. And already that is discrimination. So we are circumventing that. And I very much hope that this is how the AI regulation is going to look like, and maybe also what is going to be the content. However, as I said, the AI regulation so far has not been enforced. It is still under discussion. So this is just an outline on how the world could look like when the AI regulation comes into force. Okay, you have basically done almost everything, and you have almost gone through the whole pain with me. Here are just some of the further research questions that I thought you might want to consider in the future. One of them being data protection by design. Data protection by design is basically a wonderful thing. It is one of the articles in the GDPR that are thought through quite easily, but they're so vague that nobody's actually adhering to them. Privacy by design means that we are supposed to actually plan what we are doing. We are supposed to plan in privacy in the first place, and not start thinking about privacy when our model is done, when our product is safe, and the first person comes to complain. This is something that I believe is very important when you want to be compliant with the GDPR. You need to do a lot of planning beforehand when you have a product so that you can actually ensure, because some things you will not get after, like the explainability. Then we have one that is the machine learning and the right to be forgotten. There's a lot of distance between the legal research and the actually scientific computer science research. So what you will oftentimes find is that things might not be so important for you, but they're extremely important in the legal research. And in this case, there's a huge discussion about how can we actually delete personal data when it comes to machine learning and AI. Maybe you want to have a look at this. And then obviously ethical AI, which is what I tried to make you a little bit aware of today, which is questions on how we can avoid discrimination, how we can acknowledge privacy as the right that we are thinking in the EU it is, and how can we ensure that AI and machine learning are not just going to be used to manipulate people or to manipulate certain classes of people. Okay, if you don't have any more questions, then we're already done and you're already relieved. I see a lot of nodding and no questions. Okay, I don't think I see any questions here. So